All good?
Thank you. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Kent Branch March 2024 educational presentation. We are co-hosting with the Wellsberg District Historical Society and Museum. My name is Colleen LeBay, and I'm part of the Kent Branch operating team. Also joining us is Henry Van Haren from Wellsberg Historical Society, as well as Angela Church entering the chat for questions. We thank you for joining us. We do have a couple of housekeeping items. Our presentations are recorded and available on our Kent Branch YouTube channel, which is open to everyone. Your microphones and cameras have been turned off, but we welcome your questions. If you hover your mouse near the bottom of your screen, you'll see the bar with the chat icon. Looks like a little chat box. If you click on that, the chat box will open. You can type your message or questions for us and for the speaker, and at the end of Cameron's talk, Angela will be reading the questions back. Before we begin tonight's presentation, Bob Daly, a member of the Lenape Nation and a Kent Branch member, offers the territory acknowledgement.
The land on which we gather, learn, and play is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lunapawak, and Potawatomi peoples who have long-standing relationships to the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. The local First Nations of this area include Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, the Caldwell First Nation, Chippewa of Kettle and Stony Point, Oneida Nation of the Thames, the Delaware Nation at Moraviantown, the Munsee Delaware Nation, and Walpole Island First Nation. Additionally, there is a growing urban indigenous population who make the cities of southwestern Ontario home. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations of Turtle Island.
Okay, so let's get started. For anyone joining us for the first time, let me tell you a little bit about Ontario Ancestors. Ontario Ancestors, also known as the Ontario Genealogical Society, is a nonprofit registered charity which was founded in 1961. It is the largest genealogical society in Canada, and the mission is to encourage, bring together, and assist those interested in the pursuit of family history and to preserve Ontario's genealogical heritage. Be sure to visit the website to learn more about the resources and support available to assist you in your family history research. Ontario Ancestors has over 30 branches and several special interest groups all across Ontario, and we are the Kent Branch. Our Family History Library is located on the second floor of the Chatham-Kent Public Library in Chatham. It holds over 45 years worth of historical and genealogical resources for Chatham-Kent. We're open to the public on Fridays and Saturdays from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., and we try to accommodate other times by appointment. We always like to connect with people interested in genealogy and local history. You can connect with us at this email. You can also join our Kent Branch Facebook group, which has over 850 people who are interested in genealogy and Chatham-Kent history. And we also have a very comprehensive website with lots of resources for both our branch members and for the general public. Here are some upcoming local events that might be of interest to you. We will be holding our second DNA drop-in on March 25th from 5:30 to 8 p.m. in our Family History Room at the Chatham-Kent Public Library. This session is free and open to anyone interested in DNA. Space is limited, so to reserve your spot, email us at kent@ogs.on.ca. You might be interested in Essex Branch's March webinar. It's on March 12th at 7 p.m. with Jean Ray Baxter, who will be discussing the Winter of Content, 1838 and the invasion of Pelee Island. This is a good one. I saw this one a few months ago with the Bicentennial UEL. Very interesting. Our Lambton Branch webinar is also on March 12th at 7 p.m. with Alan Campbell, sharing his deep dive into the life of George Hyde. And in April, we will co-host an archivist from the Diocese of the Huron Archives with Essex Branch. The Archivists will be discussing the genealogical research through religious repositories that are available for Kent and Essex counties. So let's get to tonight's webinar. I'll turn it over to Henry to share a little bit about what's happening at the Wallaceburg Museum and to introduce our speaker. Welcome, Henry. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Henry Van Haren, and I am president of the Wallaceburg and District Historical Society. Our board and other members of the Wallaceburg community volunteer our time to help keep the Wallaceburg Museum an enjoyable and educational place to visit. We organize and run several events and activities throughout the year to showcase the past of this area and to fundraise in order to update our exhibits and digitize our document collections. Some of our upcoming events include a vendor sale, which we held on March 23rd, an Easter high tea luncheon on March the 30th at noon. We'll be holding a Wonderful World of Glass event on May 29th and June 30th, which details all aspects of glass, its uses and importance around the world and beyond. We are also celebrating our 40th anniversary this year at our location at 505 King Street in Wallaceburg. And that'll be on June 29th, the Canada Day weekend. What I'm really excited to do today in partnership with our local OGS is to introduce our guest presentation this evening. She is Cameron Allen and is the author of Anangokaa, a Kirkus-starred review novel and chosen among the Miramichi's Review's Best Books of 2023. Cameron lives in Eastern Ontario along the St. Lawrence Seaway with her soldier husband, 2 children, playful dog, and alpha cat. Cameron Allen will bring us along on her journey to discover the ancestors who would become the fictionalized protagonist in her book, Anangokaa. What began with an Ancestry DNA test to correspondence and meetings with distant cousins, a journey to Cameron's ancestral birthplace on the Isle of Mull, Scotland, archival and historical research, travels to the land her ancestors settled in Upper Canada in 1804 called Baldoon, and culminating in her writing her debut novel. She appeared at our Baldoon Days event last year to sign and sell copies of her book. Please welcome Cameron Allen with her presentation tonight. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Henry. All right, let me know, is that coming up?
Looks
Yep.
good, Cameron. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm just going to move this over so I can see my notes. Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Thanks to the Kent branch of the Ontario Ancestors for inviting me to share with you tonight, and to the Wallaceburg Museum for co-hosting. I've named my presentation Storytelling Our Ancestors, Genealogy and Fiction. Just shy of a year ago, in April of 2023, I published the historical novel Anangokaa. Anangokaa is a fictionalized account of the first winter my ancestor, Flora McCallum, spent in Upper Canada in 1804, when she was 14 years old. Though this novel is fictionalized, Flora's story is rooted in history. Tonight, I'd like to share with you a little bit about the historical Flora McCallum and her family at the time of Baldoon's inception. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Flora McCallum, or Mick Callum, since in the Highlands, the Micks and the Macs were interchangeable. The historical Flora was born in the Highlands, possibly on the Isle of Mull, around 1790, possibly to Mary Morrison McCallum and Donald McCallum. I say possibly because at the outset, we encounter a mystery surrounding Flora. The old parish records surrounding her baptism have yet to be located. The parish records for all but one of the other McCallum children have been found, and they document their births as being on Mull. We know Mary and Donald McCallum also had a son named John, who was born the same year as Flora was said to have been born. We have located John's parish records, but he disappears from the historical record. He does not come to North America with his parents. It is possible he did not survive infancy and that Flora was conceived on the coattails of John's birth. Some old parish records have been lost or destroyed. The Church of Scotland's registers were also costly, so it is possible that for whatever reason, Flora's baptism was simply not recorded. But it is also possible Flora was not born to Mary McCallum at all. It's possible she was born to another family, perhaps relations of Donald or Mary, and taken in to be raised by them. We do see several Floras who were born on Mull, right in the same parish as the other McCallum children, and others who were born on nearby Isle of Tiree in the 1789, 1790, and 1791 years, to families who very well might have been related to Mary. This is all a mystery that I hope to solve someday. Mysterious origins aside, the McCallum family was landless, and like other landless families of the time, they would have paid service to the subtenant of the local chief in return for a little grazing on the township pasture. Her family likely also at times harvested kelp, which profited their landlord, as the potash was used in the making of glass, fertilizer, and soap. And they would have cut peat in the bogs to burn for fuel and warmth. Flora's family spent much of their time in the northwestern area of Mull, which you'll see, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, was called Moreness. Now it's called Mornish, as shown in the boxed area on the map. Donald McCallum is listed on some records as a farmer and others as a miller. The McCallum Kirk, their church, was Kilmore, located in Derveg, which is shown right here by this yellow star. Flora McCallum's journey. A wealthy philanthropist, Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk, toured the Highlands in the 1790s, and according to some sources, he felt great sympathy for the impoverished Hebrideans who were on the lowest rung of post-Cloden clan society. One descendant of the McCallums, historian Jane Kinney of Michigan, did not necessarily see Selkirk with those rose-colored glasses. She would later write, Selkirk's arguments to induce the people to take part in his schemes were not without plausible exaggeration and honeyed words. He may have been a philanthropist, but was just as surely an adventurer and used those things necessary to forward his plans. In any event, Flora's family was among 15 Hebridean families convinced by Selkirk to sail to the New World and settle land in Upper Canada, south of today's Wallaceburg. Their journey actually began in 1803, but with Napoleon's wars raging on the high seas, the Highlanders overlaid for about a year on Selkirk's family estate in Kirkcudbright in Scotland's lowlands. It all seemed so promising, which brings us to our last bullet. Flora and her siblings were orphaned within the first weeks of the Highlanders' arrival at Baldoon. Before we arrive on the riverbanks of Baldoon, I'd like to introduce you to Flora's family and show you where she spent her formative years. Flora's family may have lived in a stone cottage on Mull, in one such as this, or even smaller. In 1804, her immediate family consisted of her father, Donald, 50, her mother, Mary Morrison, 40, her older brother, Hugh, 18, her older sister, Isabel, 16, herself, 14, her sister, Amelia, also called Emily, 9, Margaret, also called Maggie or Peggy, 7, and little Anne, who was 4. This is a view from Derveg, in and around the area where my ancestors spent much of their time. It looks today much as it would have looked over 200 years ago. The Isle of Mull is the second largest island of the Inner Hebrides, with a coastline of about 300 miles of cliffs, sandy bays, basalt columns, and pink granite crags. The ocean teems with whales, porpoises, fish, and dolphins, the sky with sea eagles, merlins, and osprey, and the land with red deer. The land is mountainous and covered with bracken and heather, trees such as birch, oak, rowan, and wild cherry, and spring brings a riot of wild daffodils, bluebells, primroses, and violets. Regardless of the beauty of the landscape and the bounty of wildlife, amidst the first slow wave of highland clearances, Flora's father must have felt compelled by Selkirk's offer to take a chance at life in North America, where he could eventually own 200 acres of land. In this photo, my daughter and I are walking in the heart of the island. We could really feel the absence of those missing islanders everywhere around us. This is the view from near Flora's childhood church, Kilmore. Donald and Mary McCallum brought with them to North America a letter of recommendation from their minister. This would have been treasured, especially by Mary. In those times, as I discovered, families or members of families could be and often were cast out from their kirk for unfitting behavior such as drunkenness, brawling, infidelity, and something that we found mentioned quite often called the guilt, which meant sleeping with someone outside of marriage. Needless to say, those members would not have had a letter of recommendation to bring with them. The letter we found in the Ontario Archives in Toronto. There is such a poignancy in reading it, knowing what we all know, and what Mary and Donald could not have known. Not only was there no parish, no church to receive them anywhere in the wilderness, in or around Baldoon, but they themselves and one of their daughters would fall ill and die within their first few weeks in their new land. The letter reads, "The bearer, Donald McCallum, and his wife, Mary Morrison, natives of this parish of Kilmore on the island of Mull, where they resided the greatest part of their time, have the characters of honest and discreet persons, and have been admitted to all church privileges in the congregation of their parish. And as they now propose to go with their family, with son and 5 daughters, to America, these are certifying that there is no reason known to me why they may not meet with suitable encouragement from whom it may concern. Given at," and there's a place that we haven't quite deciphered, 30th of March, 1803, by Arch MacArthur, minister. And here's a view much like Flora would have had as she departed the island. She would never see her homeland again. Hugh McCallum's granddaughter, Jane Kinney, wrote, "The somber old castle on its summit spoke only of the days when Mull itself had its clans and petty governments. When they sailed from Tobermory, it was a sad parting. Neighbors and friends flocked to the shore to say a last goodbye, parents giving a last embrace to their children whom they could not expect to see again." I took this photo on a boat ride off the coast of Mull in 2016, and it was quite easy for me to imagine the homesickness Flora must have felt for the rest of her life. On the left is an image from A.E.D. Mackenzie's book, Baldoon, and it shows the ship Flora and her family sailed on from Scotland to North America. Once the settlers had disembarked the Oudon and were traveling west along the waterways, there is a mention of Flora's mother found in Selkirk's papers, as shown in the letter on the right-hand side. Mary is mentioned as, quote, "D. McCallum's wife complained meal insufficient, wants compensation for want of potatoes, directed P. MacDonald to give out Indian meal and corn while detained at Fort Erie, according to proportions at the aisle, fresh beef extra in lieu of milk. I just love that it's Flora's mother who speaks up. Within weeks, Mary would die, but her words echo forever. And here's the view from the location of the settlement of Baldoon, along the shore of the Snai, also called the Shnei Carte. When the Highlanders arrived upon the banks of their new home in September, incessant autumn rains fell, and a lack of ready housing combined to weaken the exhausted travelers. Cabins that Selkirk had commissioned to be built before their arrival were left unbuilt. The settlement had actually been abandoned by workmen who fled, it's been said, from their fear of local tribes. The settlers lived in makeshift tents instead, feasted upon by mosquitoes carrying malaria that was bred in the marshland. They were too ill to frame in shelters before the long, bitterly cold and snowy Canadian winter settled in. This photo I took earlier this year, actually when I was at Baldoon Days, and it's standing along the banks of the Snai looking toward St. Anne Island. This is a view Flora and her siblings would have become quite familiar with as they adapted to their new life in their new land as orphans. I visited this same area a few times now over the years, and there is such a palpable sense of the history and such a feeling that the ancestors are here. This passenger list documents the 15 original Baldoon families who sailed over on the Oudon. You can see, if you look at the first name in each bracket, how relatively young the fathers and the mothers are, mostly in their 30s and their 40s. The eldest sons range from 6 years old to 18. It seems like such a recipe for success. For anyone who's familiar with the story of Baldoon, you'll know that there were forces at work which overpowered even the youth and the hardiness of these Hebridean islanders. As they were making their journey across Upper Canada, Baldoon was already becoming a burial ground. The shepherd, Johnson, his wife, died of either illness or childbirth. The foreman, Burns, died of a fever. And within just the first 2 months of their arrival, 14 of these Highlanders were dead. Over 20 men, women, and children died within the first year. Many of manager Alexander MacDonald's earliest letters to Lord Selkirk are replete with names of the dead. Among those to die in the first months were, if you start at the left-hand column at the top, Peter MacDonald and his wife Mary MacDonald, Donald McCallum and his wife Mary McCallum, and their daughter Amelia McCallum, John McDougald, Angus McPherson, Alexander MacDonald, his wife, and one of their children, Donald MacDonald and his daughter Catherine, Ellen McLean's mother-in-law. Over 1/3 of the Highland men who brought their families from Scotland in hopes of a more prosperous life in North America were soon gone. If you look at the ages of the children who were orphaned, you begin to get a sense of the devastation. In the 2 MacDonald families, the eldest were only 13-year-old boys. Those boys were sent away to boarding schools far from the wilderness until they were old enough to be used as clerks, and then potentially until they were old enough to be indented to Selkirk and work the land. I imagine that the girls were taken in by other families. My 5th great-grandparents, Donald and Mary McCallum, were the very first settlers to die, along with one of their daughters, Amelia, who was only 9. Flora, my ancestor, and her living siblings were fortunate in one regard, and that is that they remained together. Their older brother, Hugh, was 18 years old, and he was learned and capable enough to even volunteer as the settlement schoolmaster. Her older sister, Isabel, was 16 and old enough to be a mother figure to her sisters. Death was not the only misfortune. Unrelenting illness was another. This letter from Baldoon's manager, MacDonald, less than a year after the settlers arrived to Selkirk, makes it clear how much the Highlanders are continuing to suffer. At the writing of this letter, the orphaned McCallum children and most of the living women and children had been relocated to the town of Sandwich, which is today's Windsor, Ontario. If they were walking, it would be about a day's journey west. There, they were seen by a doctor, and according to MacDonald's letters, they were given wine and bark, which I imagine is what they called Peruvian bark, and it contains quinine, which was useful for malaria. MacDonald credited these things with preventing even more death. He also rented a house there in July at Selkirk's expense at a rate of £2 per month, in which to house all the sick until the end of September or October, when he hoped they would be well enough to return to Baldoon. He writes, "My lord, I returned to this place from Baldoon yesterday. Dr. Richardson, who accompanied me thither, was an eyewitness of the wretched state of many of the settlers and urged the propriety of an immediate removal. The only family now remaining at Baldoon is Mackenzie's. They were too unwell to be removed, and I fancy that before now, the eldest boy is dead." He goes on to list a handful of men who remained at Baldoon, but adds, quote, "Of those men, Alan McLean is the only one able or willing to work. The others are more or less indisposed. In short, my lord, no one is willing to remain." He adds this heartrending plea, "For heaven's sake, my lord, lose no time in instructing me how to proceed. You will find that your views will be frustrated and that you cannot effect a permanent settlement at Baldoon." He continues on later, "There were originally 15 heads of families, the first of whom arrived at Baldoon on the 5th September last. Besides women and children, 5 of those were dead before the 20th of October. 2 have died during the last month, and 2 are in a dangerous situation." In another letter, he writes of feeling a nausea at my stomach each time he visits the sick, despite his precaution of chewing wormwood during his visits. Even the Canadians he hires to do work fall ill, and he is forced to discharge them. To get a sense of Baldoon, here is an early map as drawn by the surveyor Clark. What is significant about the location that Selkirk chose is how little forest there was to clear. This he considered to be the advantage of his settlement, especially for grazing sheep. In reality, the location was essentially a river basin during the rainy seasons. Where you see swamp, marsh, and meadow indicated on the map became waterlogged in the spring and autumn rains. This proved catastrophic in those early days before the ditches to channel the excess water could be created, which in time made very arable farming land. As MacDonald cried to Selkirk in his early letters, "The effect which its noxious vapors has had on my constitution is conclusive evidence to me of their baneful quality, and I am free to repeat what I have more than once told your lordship, that it can never be a healthy place." On this close-up map, we can see the crops Selkirk planned for Baldoon: oats, wheat, Indian corn, turnip, peas, and plenty of pasture and wild meadow for the sheep to graze. Until the property was drained by that labor-intensive digging of ditches, however, those early crops were swamped and heavily blighted, affecting both settlers and sheep, and confounding the goal of self-reliance and profitability for the settlement. And a lack of drainage was not the only concern. In another deploring letter MacDonald wrote to Selkirk during that first year, he mentions no plowing could be done last autumn. What has been done during the last spring has been unproductive. A field of peas and barley, which some time ago had a fine appearance, has been, by the long continued drought and intrusive heat, quite parched up and quite unfit to cut. In another, he writes of a tornado, which carried off the roof and rafters of the house, uprooted trees, and leveled the chimney. Now, if you look at the map and you see where I've written St. Anne above the word island, the island was at some point called St. Anne by MacDonald and Selkirk. But in his earliest letters to Selkirk, MacDonald refers to it simply as the island. It is part of the unceded territory, which continues westward onto the much larger island Bikejwanon, meaning where the waters divide, which we also know as Walpole Island, and in early letters was often called Warpole Island, sometimes St. Mary's Isle. It is home to Ojibwa, Potawatomi, and Ottawa First Nations. Before we continue, please notice the crops, sheepfold, and shepherd's house highlighted in yellow on St. Anne Island. Treaties, verbal agreements, and questionable undertakings. While such a troubling topic is beyond the scope of my presentation, this often overlooked aspect of Baldoon's history informed much of Flora's fictionalized story in my novel, and I'll touch on it here briefly. Early on, I was unsettled by that previous map because I knew that St. Anne Island was part of unceded territory. Despite this, you saw that Selkirk planned to sow oats on the northern aspect of the island and keep sheep there to graze, erect a sheepfold and a shepherd's house on the northeastern shore. It wasn't only the island directly across from Baldoon that Selkirk and MacDonald had their eyes on. In a letter from MacDonald dated 1807, he wrote to Selkirk about the infinite uses of another island for pasturage and hay if the settlers are successfully moved north to Shawnee Township, which was much drier ground than at Baldoon. As you can see in the middle map, Shawnee Township is the green area labeled Treaty 7. This land was set aside for Indians allied with the British during the American Revolution. MacDonald says that although, quote, Chief Wedeninsay is dead, his son is now chief of that island, the western part of today's Walpole. MacDonald says he is on good terms with the son and believes that the Indians will be accommodating. He mentions also that the chief of St. Mary's Isle, which seems to be the eastern portion of today's Walpole, is a man he called the Big Bull. MacDonald says, the Big Bull is ceremonious in his visits to Baldoon, as a man of his consequence ought to be. And he goes on to say that this chief has always been treated with, quote, deference and kindness at Baldoon. MacDonald intends to make some agreement with him about keeping sheep on the islands. However, I found a much earlier letter in which MacDonald relates to Selkirk that he has learned petitions for purchasing Walpole and the other islands, or even leasing land on them, will be refused by the lieutenant governor. However, he adds, the lieutenant governor told him, instead of petitioning the council, he should write to Colonel Green requesting permission to use the land for 2 or 3 years. MacDonald did so and received a response, verbally, not from Green, but again from the lieutenant governor, who said he could not give written permission, but, quote, your lordship might occupy the islands in question. I had to wonder when I read that, is this the lieutenant governor saying, in effect, ask forgiveness, not permission? I found other early letters that MacDonald wrote to Selkirk, such as one back in 1805, where he mentions the wolves keep constantly hovering about the island where the sheep are being kept. And another saying that the half Spanish sheep are kept on the island. Another one saying, amidst heavy rains and squalls, he looked out of his window to see rams and lambs crossing over from the island to the mainland. That island could only be St. Anne from his vantage point at Baldoon. In 1806, amidst schemes to relocate the settlers and the settlement to yet another region that would have had better quality land, he mentioned that Shepherd Johnson will not be likely to remain on the island should the settlers leave Baldoon. He indicates later that Shepherd Johnson had already removed himself from what he called St. Mary's Isle. Also, in 1806, he writes that Walpole, and Watanes's Island really ought to be purchased somehow, some way from the Indians by Selkirk, as, quote, "The Indians do not seem satisfied with our being in possession of part of the former." Distressingly, this all indicates that sheep and a shepherd had a presence on the islands before MacDonald even mentioned trying to make an agreement with the local chief and the big chief for accommodation on the western portion of Walpole, despite the Indians not being satisfied with the presence of the sheep or the shepherd on their islands, and even before he had a verbal permission from the lieutenant governor for any use of any island. In my research, Flora's older brother Hugh emerged from the past more vividly than Flora or her sisters. According to writings by his granddaughter, Jane Kinney, Hugh was fluent in the Anishinaabe language, nurtured a poetic affinity for the waterways and landscapes surrounding Baldoon, was esteemed by Lord Selkirk and by Baldoon's manager, Alexander MacDonald. Here is one passage written by Hugh's granddaughter in a journal called The Pioneers of St. Clair County. "I have heard my grandfather McCallum telling of coming from Detroit to Lake Huron in a canoe with Dr. Sims, a British surgeon, long before there were any houses at Port Huron. Possessing the poetical nature of the Highland Scotch, I have heard him describe the loveliness of the lake and river, with bordering woodland lying as yet untouched by the axe, and the exquisite calm over all under the light of the full moon gleaming on the forest and expansive waters." In another journal, she writes, "My grandfather Hugh McCallum was an only son in a family of sisters, whose father and mother died in 1 month after reaching Baldoon. Of fine physique and good education he was, although very young, a leader. He was a teacher, and as it is called in Canada, a writer, and was doing the work of a conveyancer, and was the great friend of all who trusted their business to him. At the breaking out of the War of 1812, he volunteered, remaining all through the war. At the siege of Detroit, he was awarded a medal for gallantry. Afterward, when many of the Baldoon people went to the falls of Bear Creek, he followed. About 2 miles from Baldoon, he surveyed and platted a village and named it Wallaceburg, after the Scottish chief, Sir William Wallace. He was the first postmaster and merchant. On the breaking out of the rebellion, he raised a company and was made captain. I have in my possession many letters written to my grandfather by the Earl of Selkirk, his agents, Surveyor General, Postmaster General, and men prominent in law and business at that time in Detroit, Sandwich, and Toronto. I have also a number of articles, among them my great-grandmother's psalm book in Gaelic, brought by her from the Isle of Mull to Baldoon, an arithmetic of my grandfather's, and a book on navigation. They are all over 100 years old. The psalm book was published in 1777. It is indeed a far way from Scotland to Baldoon, but who shall say that the coming was in vain or in any way to be regretted? So I've discussed this with some of the other descendants of the McCallums that I've met over the years, and none of us have been able to source these letters to Hugh or the books that he passed down to his granddaughter. Jane Kinney's own direct line sadly died out. But if anyone out there has any leads or information, there are so many of us that would be overjoyed to learn more. Throughout my research, and it sounds like the research that other McCallum descendants have done, Flora's older brother just became near and dear to all of our hearts. In a letter from MacDonald to Selkirk, he states, "A good schoolmaster will be a great acquisition, and if one should appear, all reasonable encouragement should be offered. In the meantime, Hugh McCallum, one of the indented lads, professes to be capable of teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, and a trial may be made of his skill. Much stress need not be laid on the English language, which in our situation is perhaps no advantage. We should remember that the English language is American, and that in teaching our people English, we teach them to become Yankees." This is just a delightful quote, considering so many Baldoon descendants, myself included, even though I married a Canadian, I am a Yankee. And besides that, it indicates that the settlers spoke their native Gaelic during their first years at Baldoon. And speaking of Hugh, this was a wonderful find. It is Hugh McCallum's leather mail pouch. We found it in a search at the Ontario Archives in Toronto. As mentioned, he was the first postmaster at a post office established in 1837 in the new settlement north of Baldoon at the forks of the Sydenham River. Legend has it, the natives referred to the settlement as the village of the 40 Thieves, due to the pilfering of goods from their canoes while they traded. Hugh named the community Wallaceburg with an ending H, which has since been dropped, in honor of Sir William Wallace, the champion of Scottish independence. Returning to Flora, the historical Flora. So little is known of her earliest years at Baldoon. We know that she survived her first winter and many more winters. She came of age as an orphan in the wilderness, where there were frequent sightings of black bears, wolves which picked off settlement sheep, and rattlesnakes along the trails, where malarial illness and dysentery ebbed and flowed with the rainy seasons. The Anishinaabe natives made winter camps on the vast island of Walpole. They had maple sugar camps to the east. They hunted within the dense forests fringing the settlement and traded with the settlers. Flora begins to emerge from the shadows only really in 1809. We find a mention of her, which is really quite poignant. In this letter, addressed to Lord Selkirk, Baldoon manager MacDonald writes, "Your lordship was pleased to direct me to assist the late McCallum's daughters, if they married in the settlement. This as an encouragement to them. I informed them of it. Flora, now married to Angus MacDougall, asked me a few days since if I recollected the circumstance. I replied that I did, and would write to your lordship on the subject. She is a well-behaved young woman." This remarkable mention felt quite astonishing to me. Assisting the late McCallum's daughters alludes to an offer of money for Flora and her sisters if they marry within the settlement. It explains a mysterious payment we once found, which was made to Flora for £19, if I'm recollecting, as noted in MacDonald's accounting book. We might never know if this consideration of money influenced Flora to marry Angus MacDougall. She was the first in her family to marry. She married years before her older brother Hugh, briefly before her older sister Isabel. Isabel, interestingly enough, did not take up Selkirk's offer for assistance by marrying within the settlement. In fact, she married a Yankee. However, even though we may never know why Flora married Angus, the fact that she reminds MacDonald of Selkirk's offer echoes the determination we saw in her mother Mary when Mary spoke up about the insufficient food on the journey west. In Selkirk's accounts, we find another mention of Flora. In 1809, her family is listed as such. Donald McCallum, dead and wife. Hugh McCallum, 22, good but idle, has left sister married to Harson. This is referring to Isabel, who married the man on the American side of the St. Clair River. And Flora and Angus McDougall, and 3 young girls. Selkirk does not mention those 3 young girls living with Flora by name. This is something we came across quite often in Selkirk's papers, where he just mentions girls as girls, daughters of, sisters of, rarely names them. But we can assume that 2 of them are Flora's younger sisters, Maggie and Anna, since they are not mentioned separately under the McCallum household. One wonders why Flora is raising her sisters and not their eldest sister, Isabel, who married a man with means. The 3rd girl is a mystery. Did Flora have a daughter of her own during the first year of her marriage? It seems entirely possible, but if so, the baby did not live long enough to be included in Flora's family tree. The first child who lives long enough to be listed as her descendant is Lachlan, and he was born 5 long years after she married Angus during the war. It makes one wonder how many babies Flora might have lost during the years between her marriage and Lachlan's birth in 1814. Another possibility for the 3rd girl is that Flora has taken in someone else's child to raise. This 3rd girl is another mystery, and one that I hope to someday solve. With this mystery, we conclude the early years of Flora McCallum at Baldoon. When I chose to tell Flora's story through fiction, there was not so much to go on in the historical record, especially for those earliest years. She herself was quiet at first in my imagination. It was Hugh who revealed himself vividly. He just seems to have been a gregarious and poetic soul, and we are blessed with all that he has left behind for us to find. Slowly, Flora awakened in my mind, and she offered herself in kind of a nebulous way, which allowed me to explore more universal truths and to connect her story to a universal female settler story through those timeless experiences and emotions of loss and grief and love and determination, and one can only hope a little happiness. I'm currently researching and writing a novel based on her continuing story set during the War of 1812. Her husband, Angus, served with the Loyal Kent Volunteers, and we have found a heart-rending mention of him receiving word that Flora and the children were starving while he was away fighting. We've also found war claims documenting all that they lost when their farm was raided, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but several times during the war. And as I near the end of my presentation, here is a different kind of slide, genealogy kin. When my family and I traveled to Scotland in 2016, we were put in touch via another wonderfully generous, distantly related genealogist, Dina Palamedes, with an English woman named Meg Douglas. She was a historian who lived in a cottage on the island of Mull. Meg kept the official parish registers for the island. And one stormy day, we showed up unannounced at her cottage, and she welcomed us in with an offer of whiskey, and we sat by a roaring fire while she shared all that she knew with us. Meg was a real character. So here is a photo of her with my husband, Richard, as they are going over the books. My daughter, Paige, who was 10 at the time, and Meg became the best of friends. And they wrote to one another and sent gifts and artwork back and forth from Scotland to Canada for years. Meg passed away last year at the age of 91. So I'd like to say cheers to Meg. And closer to home in Wallsburg is a woman I like to call my newest oldest cousin, the incredible Barb Thornton, a woman many of you know and love as well. Barb and I met via an Ancestry website years ago, and she quickly became one of our favorite human beings. I was gifted my copy of A.E.D. Mackenzie's Baldoon by Barb. We have grown close over the years and exchanged emails, and we meet for lunch at the Black Goose with her daughter Kim when we're in town. Barb and I are also related across several Baldoon line, 2 Baldoon lines, and then we crisscross through other family lines in the area. We also intersect with someone in the middle picture, Lori Huff on the MacDougall side. I just owe so much to Barb's generosity and her bright spirit. Now I saved one of my favorite slides for last. When I first came across Tom Kerr's article on Margaret McCallum, accompanied by her likeness that was made from, I believe, an old glass plate negative, I had already written a few chapters of my novel. So in my mind, Maggie was just a 7-year-old little girl. She was real and quite dear to me. In my imagination, she was stoic, intense, capable. She had just lost her mother, father, and one of her older sisters. So coming across Tom's article and seeing this image of the real Maggie was just incredible. I couldn't believe, actually, that I got a chance. This is the only known photograph of a Baldoon settler. And so it was just remarkable to me that it was someone in my family line. Her gaze, just looking at this picture, is just as stoic as I imagined it would be, and also quite devastating. It really radiates a lifetime of loss and privation. But also I see determination, survival, and as Tom says in his article, she was also tenacious. And she lived, remarkably, to be nearly 95 years old. So cheers to Maggie. I'd like to give a quick mention for those who would like to learn more about Baldoon via the Ontario Ancestors Genealogy Society. You can go to their YouTube page and check out Henry Van Heren's April 2023 presentation, The Big Journey from Scotland to Kent County. And going back a little bit farther, you can check out a talk given by Brian Anderson in 2015. His is really helpful if you hope to research your own Baldoon ancestors. That was called the Baldoon Settlement, and it goes into depth about the methods and sources, the places where you can find them. There's just a lot of information about the settlers in the settlement. And so thank you so much for being here with me tonight. This has been a real pleasure to share a little bit about the historical Flora and her family. Please be in touch. I put my website up there if you want to learn a little bit more about, there's a little bit more about the history. There's some links that can take you to articles that you can read. Tells you a little bit more about the book. And you can also email me at authorcameronallen@gmail.com. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cameron. That was amazing. You can definitely tell that you're a storyteller. Some of your descriptions, you can just visualize what you're describing. I also love when someone gives you the background on something, and so every time I drive into Wallaceburg now, I'm going to know why it was named Wallaceburg, and and I don't know whether this was intentional or not, but today is the International Day of the Woman, and I think your research and your perspective of Flora and her sister Maggie just fits perfectly. for, you know, what they went through to survive that. Angela, do we have any questions that we can switch over to now?
A couple, first off, lots of thank yous, and that a lot of people really enjoyed your presentation, Cameron. And some people have read your book and also really enjoyed that as well. So just wanted to let you know. And one of the questions was, you said at the very beginning something about gathering kelp. And was that food, a product? Was it for the family to eat or something to sell?
You glitched a little bit for me there. What was that?
Sorry. You mentioned at the beginning gathering kelp, I
Yes.
think it was. Yes.
Right.
So the question was, would a food or a product, did they eat it, sell it?
Yeah. One can imagine that they would also use it in their diet, as I have seen that historically. But the reason that they were harvesting the kelp was to profit their landlords, mostly at that time. It was used in everything from fertilizer to glass making. And within 10 years, the kelp industry would actually collapse. And that caused a whole new wave of highland clearances on those islands, especially. So it points to the kelp industry as having profited the landlords quite substantially. And it was a difficult job, from what I understand.
Another question was, a lot of the letters you talked about, you said you'd gotten them from Library and Archives Canada. Were they specifically from any particular collection, or
Yes.
just you had to dig around in general?
Yes, if you go to Heritage Canadiana and look up the Selkirk papers, so it's not necessarily the easiest thing to navigate because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, and it has not only to do with the Baldoon settlement, but it also has it's Selkirk's journals, it's his Red River settlement, it's his settlement in PEI. There's, I think, something like 20 collections. If you want to find the Baldoon specific letters that McDonald writes, those are in C15. But then you can look in all the other ones. It's not easy. You have to like literally read through the pages to find mentions of everything, but they're quite fascinating. So Heritage Canadiana Selkirk letters would be where you'd find most of those.
And that's it for questions. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cameron, for joining us. Thank you, Henry, as well, for co-hosting with the branch. And
thank you.
You can expect to see the recording up on our YouTube page shortly. So good night,
Thanks so
everyone.
much.